The Alemanni rout the Romans in battle and kill the generals Charietto and Severianus. While throughout the Orient, the changing course of events was developing as we have narrated, the Alemanni, after the sad losses and wounds which they had suffered from their frequent battles with Julianus Caesar, having at last renewed their strength, which yet did not equal its old vigour, and being an object of dread for the reasons which we have mentioned above, were already overlapping the frontiers of Gaul, and immediately after the 1st of January, while throughout those ice-bound regions the grim season of winter bristled, they hurried forth in divisions, and without restraint a host was ranging everywhere. Charietto, who was then commanding general throughout both Germanies, along with soldiers eager for war, set out to meet their first division, taking as a partner in the campaign Severianus, who was also a general, an aged and feeble man, who at Cabellona commanded the Divitenses and Tungricani. Accordingly, when the force had been more closely united in one, and with the speed of haste, they had built a bridge over a small stream, the Romans, on seeing the savages at a distance, assailed them with arrows and other light missiles, while the enemy vigorously returned throw for throw. But when the forces came to close quarters and fought with drawn swords, our men's lines were broken by the foe's fiercer onset, and found no means either of resisting or of acting bravely, and when they saw Severianus, who had been thrown from his horse and pierced through by a missile, they were all terrified and put to flight. Charietto himself, by boldly opposing his body and by reproachful words, held back his retreating men, and by confidence caused by his long stand tried to wipe out shame and disgrace, but fell pierced by a fatal shaft. After his death, the standard of the Euroli and Batavians was taken, which the barbarians, with insulting cries and dancing with joy, frequently raised on high and displayed, until after hard struggle it was recovered. Jovianus, commander of the cavalry in Gaul, unexpectedly attacks 2 companies of the Alemanni and cuts them to pieces. He vanquishes a third part of the savages in a battle at Chalon-sur-Marne, where 6,000 of the enemy were killed and 4,000 wounded. The news of this disaster was received with extreme grief, and de Galliafus was sent from Paris to make good the defeat, but since he delayed for a long time under pretext that it was impossible for him to attack the barbarians while they were scattered over various places, he was recalled a little later in order to receive the consular insignia with Gratianus, who was still a private citizen. Then Jovianus, commander of the cavalry, was appointed to the task, and after being most thoroughly equipped and prepared, carefully guarding both wings of his army, he arrived near a place called Scarpona. There he suddenly fell upon a great throng of the savages, took them by surprise before they could arm themselves, and in a short time utterly annihilated them. Then he led his soldiers on, rejoicing in the glory of the bloodless victory, to destroy the 2nd division of the enemy, and the glorious leader was advancing slowly, when he learned from a trustworthy scouting party that after plundering the neighbouring farmhouses a predatory band was resting near the river. On coming near, and being hidden in a valley concealed by a thick growth of trees, he saw that some were bathing. others were reddening their hair after their national custom, and still others were drinking. So taking advantage of this most favourable time, he suddenly gave the signal with his clarions and broke into the robbers' camp, while on the other hand the Germans, merely uttering boastfully vain threats and shouts, were pressed so hard by the victor that they could not gather up their arms, which were lying about here and there, not form a line, not rally for a stout resistance. Therefore most of them fell, run through by pikes and swords, except such as took to their heels, and found shelter on the winding and narrow paths. His confidence now increased by this successful stroke, the result of both valour and good fortune. Jovianus led on his soldiers, sending ahead an efficient scouting party and hastily advancing against the remaining 3rd Division, and when by a rapid march he came near Chalons, he found the enemy fully ready for battle. Having measured off a stockade to suit the conditions, and refreshed his men with food and sleep, so far as the time allowed, at the first coming of dawn he drew up his battle line in the open plain, and he extended it with such skilful art that the Romans, who were inferior in numbers though equal in strength, by occupying a greater space appeared to be as numerous as the enemy, and so when the signal had been given by the trumpet and they began to engage at close quarters, the Germans stood amazed, terrified by the fearful sight of the gleaming standards, and for a while their ardour was blunted. But they quickly recovered and prolonged the fighting to the end of the day. Our vigorously attacking soldiers would have gained the fruit of victory without losses, had not Balcabaudes, tribune of the heavy-armed guard, a man by nature both boastful and cowardly, withdrew in disorder at the approach of events, and if the rest of the cohorts had followed his example and left the field, the affair would have come to such a sad ending that not one of our number could have survived to tell what had happened. But the soldiers resisted with bold energy and courage, and were so superior in strength that they wounded 4,000 of the enemy and killed 6,000 more, while they themselves lost no more than 1,200 and had only 200 wounded. When therefore the battle was now broken off by the coming of night, and the wearied soldiers had recovered their strength, their distinguished general towards daybreak led forward his army in square formation, and finding that the savages had slipped away under night, free from worry from ambuscades, he followed them over the open and easy plains, trampling underfoot the dying and the contracted bodies of those who, since the severity of the cold had drawn their wounds together, the extreme pain had taken off. Then, after advancing further, but returning on finding none of the enemy, he learned that the Ascari, whom he himself had sent by another route to plunder the tents of the Alemanni, had captured a king of the hostile army with a few of his followers, and had gibbeted him. Angered at this, he decided to punish the tribune who had ventured to take this action without consulting higher authority, and he would have condemned him to death if he had not been clear from convincing evidence that the cruel deed had been committed through passion to which soldiers are prone. When Jovianus returned to Paris after these brilliant victories, Valentinian went out joyfully to meet him, and shortly afterwards made him a consul. And you may be sure it added to his great happiness that he had received at that same time the head of Procopius, sent to him by Valens. Beside these battles, many other less worthy of mention were fought in various parts of Gaul, which it would be superfluous to describe, both because their results led to nothing worthwhile, and because it is not fitting to spin out a history with insignificant details. Events at Rome. At this time, or a little earlier, a new type of portent appeared in Annonerian Tuscany, and even those skilled in the interpretation of omens could not tell what it portended. In the town of Pistoria, About 9 in the morning, a donkey mounted the tribunal before a crowd of witnesses and brayed persistently, to the astonishment of all who were present or heard of it. No one could guess what was to happen, but afterwards the meaning of the portent became clear. Terentius, a Roman of low birth, and a baker by trade, was rewarded with the governorship of the same province for accusing the ex-prefect Orphitus of embezzlement. This emboldened him to stir up trouble in a big way, but finally he was convicted of fraud in some business with a guild of shippers. That at any rate was the story, and perished by the hands of the executioner during the urban prefectship of Claudius. Long before this, however, Apronian was succeeded by Symmachus, a man of the most exemplary learning and discretion. Through his efforts, the holy city enjoyed peace and plenty to an unusual degree, and can boast of a splendid and solid bridge, which he restored and dedicated, to the great joy of the citizens, who nevertheless some years later demonstrated their ingratitude in the plainest way. They set fire to his beautiful house across the Tiber, enraged by a story invented without a shred of evidence by some worthless ruffian, that Symmachus had said that he would rather use his wine to quench lime kilns than sell it at the reduced price that the people hoped for. Symmachus was succeeded in the government of the city by Lampadius, a former praetorian prefect. His vanity was such that he took it very ill if his manner of spitting was not extolled for its unique adroitness, but nevertheless he was sometimes strict and honest. When he gave a magnificent show as praetor and distributed largesse on a most generous scale, he could not bear the clamorous demands of the populace that he should make gifts to its undeserving favourites, and in order to demonstrate both his liberality and his contempt for the mob, summoned needy folk from the Vatican and bestowed rich presents on them. Of his vanity I will avoid further digressions by giving a single instance, slight in itself but a warning to high officials. In all parts of the city which had become beautified by the generosity of various emperors, he had his own name inscribed, not as the restorer of ancient buildings, but as their founder. This is a fault under which the Emperor Trajan is said to have laboured, but it earned him the satirical nickname of Wallflower. Lampadius' term of office was disturbed by frequent riots. The worst occurred when a mob of the lowest canali attacked his house near the baths of Constantine with torches and firebrands, and would have set it alight if his neighbours and servants had not rushed to the spot and repelled the attackers by pelting them from the roof with stones and tiles. Lampidius himself had fled in panic at the first sign of trouble to the Milvian bridge, which is said to have been built by the elder Scaurus. There he waited until the tumult should subside. A serious grievance had arisen which gave rise to this riot. In preparing to erect new buildings or restore old ones, he did not provide for the expenses from the usual public funds. If iron or lead or bronze or the like were needed, minor officials were sent in the guise of purchasers to carry off the various materials without payment. His rapid flight barely saved him from the fury of the enraged and impoverished people, who had continual losses to deplore. Lampidius' successor was Viventius, a former questor of the palace, an upright and wise Pannonian, under whose quiet and peaceful administration there was general plenty, but he too had to endure an alarming outbreak of violence by the turbulent populace, which arose as follows. Damasus and Ursinius, whose passionate ambition to seize the episcopal throne passed all bounds, were involved in the most bitter conflict of interest, and the adherents of both did not stop short of wounds and death. Viventius, unable to end or abate the strife, was compelled by force majesty to withdraw to the suburbs. The efforts of his partisans secured the victory of Damascus. It is certain that in the Basilica of Cincinus, where the Christians assembled for worship, corpses were found on a single day, and it was only with difficulty that the long-continued fury of the people was later brought under control. Considering the ostentatious luxury of life in the city, it is only natural that those who are ambitious of enjoying it should engage in the most strenuous competition to attain their goal. Once they have reached it, they are assured of rich gifts from our ladies of quality. They can ride in carriages, dress splendidly, and outdo kings in the lavishness of their table. They might be truly happy if they would pay no regard to the greatness of the city, which they make a cloak for their vices, and follow the example of some provincial bishops, whose extreme frugality in food and drink, simple attire, and downcast eyes demonstrate to the supreme God and his true worshippers the purity and modesty of their lives. But enough of the digression. Let me now return to my main narrative. A description of the 6 provinces of Thrace and their peoples, and the famous cities in each. While the above-mentioned events were taking place in Gaul and Italy, a new campaign was set on foot in Thrace, for Valens, in accordance with the desire of his brother, whom he consulted and by whose will he was guided, took up arms against the Goths, influenced by a just reason, namely that they had sent aid to Procopius when he began his civil war, and it will be fitting then to sketch hastily in a brief digression the early history and the topography of those regions. A description of Thrace would be easy if the pens of the earlier writers agreed, but since their obscurity and their differences lend no aid to a work whose aim is truth, it will suffice to set forth what I myself remember to have seen. That this land formerly consisted of a boundless expanse of gentle plains and lofty mountains, we know from the immortal testimony of Homer, who imagines that the north and west winds begin to blow from there. But this is either a fable or else in former times the widely extended tracts marked out to be the home of the barbarian tribes were all included under the name of Thrace. A part of these were inhabited by the Scordisci, who are now widely separated from those same provinces, a people formerly cruel and savage and, as ancient history declares, accustomed to offer up their prisoners as victims to Bellona and Mars, and from their hollowed skulls greedily to drink human blood. But their savageness the Roman state was often sorely troubled by, and after many lamentable calamities finally lost a whole army with its commander to them. But as we now see them, those same places, formed in the shape of a crescent moon, present the appearance of a beautiful theatre. At its western summit are the steep mountains through which the narrow pass of the Succi opens, separating Thrace from Dacia. The left side, towards the northern stars, is shut off by the lofty height of Mount Haemus and the Hister, which, where it washes Roman soil, borders on many cities, fortresses, and castles. On the right, which is the south side, extend the cliffs of Rhodope, and where the morning star rises it is bounded by the strait which flows with an abundance of water from the Euxine, and going on with alternating current to the Aegean, opens a narrow cleft between the lands. But on the eastern corner the land is connected with the frontiers of Macedonia by a steep and narrow pass, which is called Acontesima. Next to this is the posting station of Arethusa. in which is to be seen the tomb of Euripides, noted for his lofty tragedies, and Stagira, known as the birthplace of Aristotle, who, as Cicero says, poured forth a golden stream. These regions also were occupied in former times by barbarians, who differed from one another in custom and language. Of these, the Odrysiae are noted for their savage cruelty beyond all others, being so habituated to the shedding of human blood that when there were no enemies at hand at their feasts after the satiety of food and drink, they plunged their swords into the bodies of their own countrymen as if they were those of foreigners. But when our country increased in power and the rule of consuls was in full sway, Marcus Didius, with great determination, checked these tribes that before had always been invincible and were roaming about without civilization or laws. Drusus confined them within their own bounds. Minucius utterly defeated them in battle near a river called Hebrus, which flows from the high mountains of the Odrysiae. And after these, the survivors were completely annihilated by the proconsul Appius Claudius in a hot fight. Indeed, the Roman fleets took possession of the towns situated on the Bosphorus and the Propontis. After these came General Lucullus, who was the first of all to encounter the savage tribe of the Bessi, and in the same onslaught overcame the Haemontani in spite of their stout resistance. While he threatened that region, all parts of Thrace passed under the sway of our forefathers, and in this way, after dangerous campaigns, 6 provinces were won for the Republic. The first of these, on the side bordering on Illyricum, is called Thrace in the narrow sense, and is adorned by the splendid cities of Philippopolis and Borea. After this, Haemontus, which has Hadrianopolis, and Anchialos, both great and rich cities. Then comes Mysia, with Marcianopolis, so named from the sister of the Emperor Trajan, Durosterus, Nicopolis, and Odysseus. Hard by is Scythia, in which the more famous towns are Dionysopolis, Tomi, and Catalia. Europa, the remotest province of all, in addition to various towns, is conspicuous for 2 cities, April and Perinthus, in later times called Heraclea. Rhodope, next to this, has Maxianopolis, Maronia, and Aenus, where Aeneas founded and abandoned a city, and after long and wandering times under continued good auspices reached Italy. Now it is well known, as constant reports have spread abroad, that almost all the country folk who dwell in the high mountains throughout the lands just described surpass us in health and strength, and in the prerogative, so to speak, of prolonging life, and it is thought that this is due to absence from a conglomeration of diet and from hot baths, and a lasting freshness knit their bodies through cold springs with dew, and they enjoy the sweetness of pure air. Further, they are first of all to feel the rays of the sun, which are by their nature life-giving, before they are infected with any stains from human affairs. After having thus given an account of these matters, let us return to our task. Valens makes war on the Gothic allies of Procopius, AD 367. Once Procopius had been crushed in Phrygia, and the occasion of civil strife removed, Victor, the master of cavalry, was sent to the Goths to ask, without beating about the bush, why a people friendly to Rome and bound by a long-standing treaty of peace had helped an usurper to make war upon the lawful emperors. The Goths, believing that they had a strong case, produced a letter from Procopius asserting that he was merely assuming the throne, which was his due, as a close kinsman of the house of Constantine. They claimed that they had fallen into a pardonable error. On receiving Victor's report, Valens brushed aside this empty excuse and took the field against the Goths, who had advanced information of his movements. In early spring he concentrated his army, established his base near the fort called Daphne, and crossed the Danube on a bridge of boats without encountering any resistance. His confidence grew as he scoured the country without finding an enemy to defeat or overawe, since the whole body, alarmed by the approach of so formidably equipped a foe, had made for the high mountains of the Seri, which are inaccessible to anyone not acquainted with the terrain. Not wishing, however, to waste the whole summer and return empty-handed, Valens dispatched the infantry commander Arinthius with some raiding parties. Some of the families of the Goths were seized while they were still wandering over the plains and before they could reach the steep and winding mountain tracts. After this meagre success, which he owed merely to chance, Valens returned with his troops without having either inflicted or suffered any serious damage. In the following year, an equally vigorous attempt to invade the enemy's territory was frustrated by the flooding of the Danube over a wide area, and Valens had to remain inactive in a standing camp near a village of the Carpi until the end of autumn. Then he retired to winter quarters at Marcellinus, since nothing could be done in view of the extent of the floods. For a third year in succession, Valens still preserved. Crossing the river by a bridge of boats at Navidium, he broke into the territory of the barbarians and made a forced march to attack the remote and warlike tribe of the Greuthungi. After some skirmishing, he defeated Athanaric, at that time their most powerful ruler, who dared to resist with what he believed to be an adequate force, but was compelled to flee for his life. Valens himself returned with his whole army to Marcianople, the most suitable place for winter quarters to be found in the region. The events of these three campaigns created a favourable climate for ending hostilities. The enemy were alarmed by the emperor's long stay in their neighbourhood, and the interruption of trade had reduced the barbarians to such want that they sent a number of delegations to beg for pardon and peace. The emperor decided that the best policy was to grant their request. In spite of his inexperience, his judgment was still sound. It was only later that he succumbed to the fatal law of flattery and inflicted on the state disasters that we can never cease to deplore. So he in turn dispatched Victor and Arinthius, commanders of the cavalry and infantry respectively, and when they sent a reliable report that the Goths were ready to agree to his terms, a suitable place was chosen for concluding the treaty. Athanaric declared that he was bound by a tremendous oath taken at the behest of his father never to set foot on Roman soil, since he could not be persuaded to do so, and it would be undignified and degrading for the emperor to cross over to him. The sensible decision was reached to conclude the treaty in midstream, the emperor with his guard being conveyed from one bank to the tribal chief with the attendants from the other. When this had been settled and hostages exchanged, Valens returned to Constantinople, where at a later date Athanaric, driven from his country by a domestic conspiracy, died and was buried with splendid rites conducted in the Roman manner. Gratian co-emperor with Valentinian. Meanwhile, Valentinian fell dangerously ill and was at the point of death. The Gauls in attendance on him held a clandestine meeting and proposed as his successor Rusticus Julianus, master of the records, a man whose bestial thirst for human blood verged upon madness, as he showed in his government of Africa as proconsul. As urban prefect, which was the office in which he died, he was forced to appear milder and more lenient because of the precarious standing of the despot who had raised him to that high position, presumably owing to a dearth of deserving candidates. The Gauls were opposed by some with higher aims, who put forward Severus, then master of infantry, as a suitable candidate. Although he was rough and inspired fear, he was easier to bear than the others, and in every way preferable. These plans, however, were hatched in vain. The Emperor recovered by the application of various remedies and, realising that he had a narrow escape from death, decided to confer the insignia of empire on his son Gratian, who was approaching manhood. When all was ready and steps had been taken to secure the approval of the troops, Gratian arrived, and Valentinian, attended by a splendid suite of high officials, approached to the parade ground and ascended the dais. Taking the boy to the right hand, he led him forward and presented the future emperor to the army in a formal speech. The imperial robe which I am wearing is a happy token of the goodwill which led you to prefer me to many distinguished rivals. You then should share my plans and promote my wishes, now that the time has come for me to take in hand my duty as a father, relying for a happy outcome on the promises of God, by whose eternal aid the Roman state will stand unshaken. I beg you, my gallant men, to give a favourable reception to my desire, bearing in mind that I wish an act sanctioned by natural affection, not merely to be brought to your knowledge, but to receive your approval as befitting us and likely to be beneficial to the state. You see before you my son Gratian, who has long lived among your own children, and whom you love as a pledge of the bonds which unite us. He is now grown, and I intend, for the preservation of public peace, to take him as my colleague in the empire, provided that the will of heaven and your sovereign power support the promptings of a father's love. He has not, like us, had a harsh upbringing from his very cradle, and been endured to the endurance of hardship, nor, as you see, is he fit to encounter the dust of battle as of yet, but before long, in conformity with the reputation of his family and the glorious deeds of his forebears, he will, if I say so myself without presumption, achieve distinction. Close observation of his character and inclinations, immature though he is, leads me to think that when he becomes a man, the training which he has acquired from a liberal education will enable him to form an impartial judgment of right and wrong. He will conduct himself in such a way that good men will recognise that he knows their value. He will be eager to perform noble deeds and will never desert the standards and eagles of his men. He will endure heat, snow and frost, thirst and lack of sleep. He will fight to defend the camp, should he ever need to do so. He will risk his life for his comrades, and above all, which is the first and highest duty, he will love the state as he loves the home of his father and of his ancestors. Before Valentinian had finished his speech, which was received with enthusiastic applause, the soldiers, each in the way appropriate to his rank, strove to outdo one another in their haste to proclaim Gratian emperor, and to play their part in this joyful and propitious event, accompanying their loud shouts with an approving clash of arms. Valentinian, encouraged and delighted by this reception, put a crown on Gratian's head, investing him with the imperial robes, and kissed him. Then he addressed him as follows, while the boy, who made a brilliant figure, listened attentively. The hopes of us all, my dear Gratian, are fulfilled by your assumption of the imperial robes, conferred on you under the happiest auspices by my will and that of our comrades. Prepare yourself to act as the colleague of your father and your uncle as the pressure of events requires. Accustom yourself to make your way boldly with the infantry over the frozen Rhine and the Danube, to stand shoulder to shoulder with your men, to shed your blood without hesitation for those under your command, and to treat nothing with indifference that concerns the welfare of the Roman people. Enough by way of admonition for the moment. I shall not fail to advise you hereafter. The rest of you who constitute the chief bulwark of the state, I beg and beseech to defend with steady affection the growing emperor committed to your care. These words from the emperor were received with profound respect. Then Eupraxius, a native of Mauritania, who was master of the records, gave a lead by shouting, "The family of Gratian deserves this honour." he was at once promoted to the quaestorship, an office of which he set an example of noble independence which wise men should follow. He never departed from his native fearlessness, but was always as firm and consistent as the law itself, which we know speaks with one and the same voice to all the most varied circumstances. His loyalty to the cause of justice became even more steadfast when the emperor rejected his good advice and tried to intimidate him with intemperate threats. Eupraxius' lead was followed by a general outburst of praise from both the elder and the boy emperor, and particularly for the latter, who was recommended by a bright gleam in his eye, a most agreeable face and figure, and a noble character. This would have made a ruler of him comparable to the best of his predecessors if fate had permitted, and if the corrupt actions of his intimates had not cast a cloud over his good qualities before they were firmly rooted. In this manner, Valentinian went beyond the long-established custom, in that his generosity led him to promote both his brother and his son to the rank of Augustus instead of Caesar. No one before had taken a colleague with power equal to his own except the Emperor Marcus, who made his adopted brother Verus his partner without any inferiority of status as an emperor. Valentinian's irascibility, savagery, and cruelty. After this business was settled in accordance with the will of the ruler and of the army, only a few days elapsed before the praetorian prefect Marcellinus, on his return from Rome, which he had visited to correct certain abuses, was accused of perculation by Avitian, a former vice-prefect. He was therefore replaced by Vulcatius Rufinus, a man perfectly qualified in every respect. To all appearances this was the crown of a long and honourable career. Nevertheless he never let pass any chance of enriching himself, if he could hope to do so undetected. As soon as he gained the emperor's ear he obtained the release from banishment of Orphidius, the former urban prefect. By Rufinus' agency his confiscated property was restored to him, and he returned to his home. Valentinian was generally known to be a cruel man, but at the beginning of his reign he strove to modify his reputation for harshness by taking some pains to control his savage impulses. But this insidious vice grew on him, though its appearance was deferred, and gradually broke out without restraint to the destruction of several persons. It gained strength from his liability to passionate outbursts of anger. Anger is defined by philosophers as a long-standing and sometimes incurable mental ulcer, usually arising from weakness of intellect. In support of this they argue with some plausibility that the tendency occurs more in invalids than in the healthy, more in women than in men, more in the old than in the young, more in those in trouble than in the prosperous. Among the executions of others of lower rank, what attracted most attention at that time was the death of Diocles, former treasurer of Illyricum, whom the emperor ordered to be burned at the stake for trivial offences, and also of Diodorus, a former agent, and 3 officials of the vice-prefect of Italy. These latter all suffered a cruel death because the commander of the forces complained to the emperor that Diodorus had brought a civil action against him, and that the 3 officials had had the audacity to summon him on the judge's orders to appear as defendant as he was setting out on a journey. The memory of these men is cherished to this day by the Christians in Milan, who call the spot where they are buried the place of the innocents. Later, in the affair of one Maxentius from Pannonia, whom the judges had very properly ordered to be immediately executed, Valentinian commanded that the local senators of the 3 towns should be put to death. The questor Eupraxius intervened, saying, "Show more restraint, your highness. These men who are to be executed as criminals on your order will be honoured by the Christians as martyrs." Eupraxius' salutary boldness was imitated by the prefect Florentius when he heard that the emperor, in a fit of passion over some venial offence, had ordered the execution of 3 senators in each of a number of cities. What happens, he said, if some town does not have as many as 3? A rider will have to be added that they shall be put to death when the town has enough. Another feature of his ruthless behaviour is as horrible to relate as it was in actual fact. If anyone, in order to avoid appearing before a powerful enemy, asked that his case should be transferred to another judge, the request was refused and he was sent back to the man he feared, however sound his plea might be. Another frightful thing which was much discussed was that when Valentinian heard that a debtor was in such straits that he could pay nothing, he pronounced a sentence of death upon him. The reason why some emperors are so arrogant as to commit these and similar acts is that they give their friends no opportunity of setting them right when they go wrong in thought or deed, and that their enormous power frightens their enemies into silence. There is in fact no way of correcting wrongdoings in those who think that the height of virtue consists in the execution of their will. Theodosius in Britain. After setting out from Amiens on a rapid march to Trier, Valentinian was shocked to receive the serious news that a concerted attack of the barbarians had reduced the province of Britain to the verge of ruin. Nectaridius, the count of the coastal region, had been killed, and the general Philophodes was surprised and cut off. Greatly perturbed by these events, the emperor sent Severus, who was still at that period the count of the household troops, to retrieve the situation if he found a suitable opportunity. Shortly afterwards, Severus was recalled and Jovianus set out for the island, but sent an appeal for strong reinforcements, which the pressing needs of the moment required. Finally, in response to the alarming reports which constantly arrived, Theodosius was selected for the task and ordered to proceed to Britain without delay. He had a great reputation as a soldier, and getting together a tough force of horse and foot, he set out on his mission with every prospect of success. In my account of the reign of Constans, I have described to the best of my ability the ebb and flow of the tides and the geography of Britain. It seems superfluous, therefore, to repeat what has already been dealt with. Ulysses in Homer shrinks in the same way from the hard task of repeating his adventures to the Phaeacians. It will suffice to say that at that time the Picts, of whom there were 2 tribes, the Dicaldones and Verturiones, together with the warlike people of the Atticotti and the Scots, were roving at large and causing great devastation. In addition, the Franks and Saxons were losing no opportunity of raiding the parts of Gaul that were nearest to them, by land and sea, plundering, burning, and putting to death all of their prisoners. In the hope that a favourable turn would enable him to put a stop to these outrages, our energetic commander set out for the ends of the earth. He reached the coast at Boulogne, which is separated from the opposite shore by a narrow strait, where the sea by turns is swollen to a dreadful height and then shrinks again to the level of a plain, when it presents no danger to navigation. From Boulogne, Theodosius made a calm crossing to Richborough, a quiet harbour on the opposite coast. On the arrival of his troops, which consisted of the Batavi and the Heruli, together with the Jovi and Victorones, a sufficiently strong force, he disembarked and marched towards the old town of London, since called Augusta. Dividing his men into several detachments, he attacked the roving parties of freebooters who were hampered by the weight of their spoils, and driving before them prisoners and cattle, he quickly routed them and wrested from them their plunder, which the wretched provincials had lost. He restored everything to its owners except for a small part which he distributed to his exhausted troops, and then entered the town in triumph. Hitherto it had been plunged in the deepest distress, but it was now re-established almost before it could have hoped for rescue. This success encouraged Theodosius to undertake operations on a larger scale, but he waited for a time in some doubt about his safest course. He had learnt from the confession of his prisoners and the information given by deserters that the scattered and widely ferocious peoples of the various tribes could be subdued only by a strategy of stealth which took them unawares. Finally, he issued a proclamation promising immunity to deserters who returned to the colours and summoning many others who were dispersed in various places on furlough. This secured the return of the majority. Theodosius' anxiety was relieved, and he asked that Civilis, a man of fiery temper but uncompromising integrity, should be sent to him to govern Britain as pro-prefect. He asked also for the services of Dulcitius, a general distinguished for his military skill. Events in Africa. Protextius as urban prefect. This is what was happening in Britain. But Africa, from the very beginning of Valentinian's reign, was victim to the fury of the barbarians, who made audacious raids to satisfy their constant thirst for blood and booty. The mischief was increased by the slackness of the troops and their eagerness to enrich themselves at the expense of others, traits which were particularly evident in their commander, Romanus. This officer, who could see what was in the wind and was adept at shifting unpopularity onto others, was detested for his brutality, and especially for his keenness to outdo the enemy in ravaging the provinces. He relied on the support of his kinsman Remigius, the master of the offices, who sent in false and conflicting reports to the emperor, who prided himself on his watchfulness, was left for a long time in ignorance of the lamentable losses of the Africans. I shall give a full account of events in this region, including the deaths of the governor Ruricius and the envoys and other disasters, when the course of my work requires it, and since I am now free to express my own opinion, I will say openly that Valentinian was the first emperor to foster the arrogance of the military to the detriment of the state, by advancing them notably in standing and wealth. In addition, he pursued a policy which is to be deplored on both public and private grounds of punishing the offences of common soldiers with inflexible severity, while treating their superiors leniently. The latter in consequence assumed that they had a licence to sin, and were encouraged to the commission of frightful crimes, and since that time have had the audacity to believe that the fortunes of all men alike depend on the will and pleasure of their commanders. The legislators of earlier times, in an attempt to humble their pride and influence, were of opinion that sometimes even innocent people must be sentenced to death. This often happens when the wrongdoing of a large number unfairly involves the punishment of some who are not guilty, a thing which has sometimes applied even in the trials of private persons. Now in Isauria, bands of brigands were overrunning the neighbouring places, harassing towns and rich villas with unrestricted pillage, and inflicting great losses on Pamphylia and the Cilicians. Musonius, the deputy governor of Asia at the time, who had formerly been a teacher of rhetoric in Attic Athens, perceived that since no one resisted them, they were devastating everything with utter destruction, so at last, finding the situation deplorable, and that the luxury of the soldiers made them feeble, he gathered together a few half-armed troops, whom they called Diogmates, and attempted to attack one band of the marauders if the opportunity should offer, but in passing down through a narrow and winding pass he came into an ambuscade, from which he could not escape, and was slain there with those whom he was leading. When the brigands, highly elated by this success, with greater confidence extended their raids in various directions, at last our troops were called out, and after killing some of them drove the rest to the rocky retreats in the mountains where they live. Then, since no opportunity was revealed there for taking rest or finding anything fit for food, they called a truce and asked that peace be granted them, following the advice of the Germaniopolitani, whose opinions were always decisive with them, as if they were those of the standard-bearers in a battle. Then they gave the hostages that were demanded and remained quiet for a long time, without venturing on any hostile act. At this period Praetaxius distinguished himself as urban prefect. His many acts of uprightness and honesty, for which he had acquired a reputation from his early years, earned him an unusual distinction. He was feared by the citizens without forfeiting their affection, which is generally weaker towards officials who inspire dread. Praetaxius' authority and his support of the cause of truth and justice quieted the disturbances caused by the quarrels of the Christians. After the banishment of Asinius, profound peace reigned, a state of affairs extremely welcome to the citizens of Rome, and the fame of their excellent governor was enhanced by a number of salutary measures. He had all projecting galleries removed. These were the invention of Ammianus, and their erection had been so banned in the early laws of Rome. He had the walls of private houses demolished where they had been built on temples without regard for their sanctity. He instituted standard weights in all parts of the city as the one way of dealing with the greed of many shopkeepers who rigged their scales to suit themselves. In trying legal cases, he achieved to a unique degree what Cicero speaks of in his eulogy of Brutus. Though he did nothing to court favour, everything that he did was favourably received. Valentinian, after crossing the Rhine, routs and puts to flight the Alemanni, who had fled to the mountain heights, but not, however, without bloodshed on both sides. At about this same time, Valentinian had begun his campaign with weariness, as he himself thought, when a prince of the Alemanni called Rando, after long preparation for his design, with a light-armed band equipped for plundering, secretly made his way into Mogontiacus, which had no garrison, and since he chanced to find that a festival of the Christian religion was being celebrated, he was not hindered in carrying off defenceless men and women of every kind of station, along with no small amount of household goods. Then, after a brief interval, the hope of better fortune unexpectedly dawned upon the Roman state. For since King Vificabius, son of Vado Marius, who was somewhat weak and sickly in appearance, but valiant and vigorous, again and again kindled the flames of war against us, no efforts were spared to dispose of him by any possible manner of death. And because after several attempts he could in no way be overcome or treacherously surrendered, he was slain by the perfidy of an attendant on his private life, through the earnest solicitations of our men, and after his death the enemy's rage slackened somewhat, but the assassin, through fear of punishment, which he dreaded in case the affair should become known, hastened to take refuge on Roman soil. After this, with especially diligent care, and with troops of various kinds, a more serious campaign than common was prepared against the Alemanni, since the public safety imperiously demanded it, for from a race that so easily recovered its strength, treacherous attacks were to be feared, and the soldiers were equally incensed against them, since the untrustworthy nature of an enemy who was at one time abject and supplicant, and soon afterwards threatening the worst, allowed them no rest or cessation from warfare. Therefore a mighty mass of troops was assembled from all quarters and carefully provided with arms and supplies of food. Count Sebastian was summoned from the Illyrian and Italian regions which he commanded, and as soon as the warm season began, Valentinian with Gratian crossed the Main. Seeing no one, the emperor divided his army and advanced in square formation, with himself in the centre and the generals Jovian and Severius guarding the flanks on both sides, in order that they might not be exposed to a sudden attack. Then, guided by men who knew the roads, and carefully reconnoitring the approaches, they at once marched slowly onwards. through a widely extended tract of country, while the soldiers, more and more eager for battle, ground their teeth in a threatening way, as if they had already come upon the savages. But since after the lapse of several days no one could be found to oppose them, all the cornfields and dwellings which they saw were laid waste by devouring flames, kindled by a band of the cohort, with the exception of such foodstuffs as doubt about the outcome of affairs forced them to gather and keep. After this the emperor went on at a slower pace, and when he came near a place called Cilicium, he halted as if checked by some barrier, since he was reliably informed by the scouting troops in the van that the savages had been seen at a distance, and in fact the enemy, seeing no way left to save their lives except to defend themselves by a swift onset, trusting to their knowledge of the ground and in general agreement with one another, had stationed themselves on a lofty mountain, surrounded on all sides by rocky and precipitous heights, and inaccessible except on the northern side, where it has an easy and gentle slope. At once our standards were planted in the usual manner, while everywhere the call to arms was sounded, but at the command of the emperor and his generals the well-disciplined soldiers stood fast, waiting for the raising of the banner, which was the signal that it was the time to begin the battle. Thereafter, because little or no time for deliberation was given, since on one side the impatience of our soldiers was alarming, and on the other the Alemanni were yelling dreadfully all around, need for quick action made this plan advisable. Then Sebastian with his men should seize the northern part of the mountains, which, as we have said, had a gentle slope, in order that if fortune should so decree, they might with little trouble strike down the Germans as they fled. The plan thus agreed upon was hastily carried out, and Gratian, whose youth was even then unequal to battles and toils, was kept back with the legion of the Joviani, while Valentinian, as a deliberate and cautious leader, with uncovered head surveyed the centuries and maniples, and without taking anyone of the higher officers into his confidence, he dismissed his throng of attendants, and with a few companions known to him for their energy and fidelity, hastened off to inspect the foot of the hills, declaring, for he had a lofty opinion of his own judgment, that another way beside that which the scouts had seen could be found leading to the steep heights. Then, as he was making his way by devious paths over unknown places and marshy bogs, a band of the enemy placed in ambush in a hidden spot would have slain him by a sudden attack, had he not resorted to the last means of safety, put spurs to his horse, ridden away through the slippery mud, and taken refuge in the bosom of his legions after an imminent danger to which he was so very close that the chamberlain who carried the emperor's helmet, adorned with gold and precious stones, completely disappeared together with the helmet itself, and could be found later neither alive nor dead. Then, after the troops had been given a rest, recovering their strength, and the standard had been raised, which is accustomed to rouse men to battle, urged on by the menacing blare of the trumpets, they advanced to attack with bold confidence. Two choice young warriors, Salvius and Lupicinus, the one a targeteer, the other belonging to the troop of Gentiles, at the very beginning of the struggle, at once dashed forward before the others, urging on the battle with terrifying shouts. Brandishing their lances, they came to the opposing mass of rocks, and while the Alemanni were trying to push them back, and they were striving to mount higher, the whole weight of our army came up, and, led by the same champions through places rough and shaggy with thickets, by a mighty effort scrambled up to the lofty heights, and with bitterness of spirit on both sides the conflict was essayed, with levelled lances, on one side soldiers more skilled in the art of war, on the other the savages, fierce but reckless, joined in hand-to-hand conflict. Finally our army, extending its lines and encircling the enemy on both flanks, began to cut them down, terrified as they were by the din, by the neighing of horses, and by the blare of trumpets. Nevertheless the foe took courage and resisted, and the contest continued with mighty struggle, the fortune of battle being for a long time undecided, while dire death and mutual destruction accompanied the fighting. But at last the Alemanni were thrown into confusion by the impetuosity of the Romans, and disordered from fear, the foremost were mangled with the hindmost, and as they turned and fled they were pierced through by our javelins and pikes. At last, in panting and exhausted flight, they exposed to their pursuers their hams, calves, and backs. Then, after many had been laid low, Sebastianus, who had been posted with his reserve troops at the back of the mountains, surrounded a part of the fugitives on their exposed flanks, and slaughtered them. The rest in scattered flight took refuge in their haunts in the forests. Career and character of Probus, AD 368. During this period, Volcatius Rufinus died in office, and Probus was recalled from Rome to succeed him as Praetorian Prefect. Probus was known all over the Roman world for his high birth, powerful influence, and vast riches. He owned estates in almost every part of the empire, but whether they were honestly come by or not is not for a man like me to say. In his case, Fortune, who, to use the language of poetry, carried him on her swift wings, took a double form. Sometimes she exhibited him as a benevolent man engaged in promoting the careers of his friends. At others he appeared as a pernicious schemer who worked off his deadly grudges by inflicting injury. Throughout his life he exercised enormous influence owing to the gifts he bestowed and the constant succession of offices he filled. There were times when he showed fear of those who stood up to him, but he took a high line with those who were afraid of him. When he felt that he was on strong grounds, he hectored in the elevated style of tragedy, but in panic he could be more abject than any down-at-heel comedian. Probus languished like a fish out of water if he was not in office. This he was driven to seek by the lawless behaviour of his countless dependents, whose excessive greed could never be satisfied in an innocent way, and who thrust their master into public life so as to be able to gain their ends with impunity. It must be admitted that he had sufficient principle never to order a client or slave to break the law, but if he heard that any had committed a crime, he would defend him in the teeth of justice itself, without any investigation of the matter, or regardless of right and wrong. This is a fault reprobated by Cicero when he says, "What is the difference between prompting a deed and approving it when it is done? Or what difference does it make whether I wished it to happen or am glad that it has happened?" Probus was by nature suspicious and petty. He could wear a sour smile and sometimes employed flattery when he meant to injure. He had a common defect of characters of his type, that is conspicuously bad, especially when its possessor believes that he can conceal it. He was so implacable and inflexible that once he had decided to injure a man he was deaf to all entreaties. Nothing could induce him to pardon an offence, and his ears seemed stopped with lead rather than the proverbial wax. Even at the height of wealth and honour he was nervous and worried, and in consequence always subjected to slight ailments. This was the course of events in the western part of the empire. Struggles with the Persians over Armenia and Iberia. For a short time after the death of the Emperor Julian and the conclusion of that shameful treaty, The great Sapor, now an old man, who had been addicted to the delights of rapine from the very beginning of his reign, seemed with his people to be on friendly terms with us. Then, however, he trampled upon the pact made under Jovian and laid hands on Armenia, intending to incorporate it in his dominions as if the agreement were no longer in force. At first he confined himself to various stratagems and inflicted only slight losses on this populous country, suborning some of the grandees and satraps and surprising others by unexpected raids. Next, by a calculated mixture of flattery and perjury, he entrapped King Arsaces himself. He was entertained at a banquet and then taken by Sapor's orders to a concealed door. His eyes were put out and he was loaded with chains of silver, which in that country is regarded as a consolation, empty though it is, for the sufferings of persons of rank. Finally, he was exiled to a fortress called Agabana, where he was tortured and dispatched by the sword of the executioner. After this, that nothing might be lacking to complete the tale of treachery, Sapor drove out Sarmaces, who had been placed by Rome on the throne of Iberia, and conferred the rule of this people on one Aspicures, on whom he also bestowed a crown to demonstrate his contempt for the authority of our rulers. Having effected these infamous designs, he entrusted Armenia jointly to a eunuch called Silasses and to Artabanes, both of whom had earlier defected to him. The former was reported to have been prefect of that people and the latter commander-in-chief. They were told to spare no effort to destroy Artagosa, a strongly held and fortified town which sheltered the treasures of Arsaces as well as his wife and son. The siege was begun in accordance with Sapor's orders. The fortress stood on a rugged height and could not be approached in the prevailing snow and frosts. So Silasses, who being a eunuch was good at pretending to be a woman, obtained a safe conduct and came quickly up to the very walls with Artabanes. His request to be allowed to enter with his colleague was granted, and with a certain amount of browbeating he urged the besieged and the queen to surrender at once, and thus soften the temper of Sapor, the most merciless of men. There was much argument on both sides, and lamentation from the woman over the sad fate of her husband. This moved the two zealous advocates of surrender to pity, and they changed their plan. Setting their sights higher, they arranged in a private meeting that at a given time in the night the gates should be suddenly flung open and a strong force sally out to surprise the enemy's camp, and they vowed to see that this plan was kept secret. This promise was sealed with an oath, and they left the city and reported back that the besieged begged to be allowed 2 days to make up their minds. The besiegers were thus lulled into inactivity, and at the time of night which men are relaxed and snoring most deeply, the city gate was unbarred and a band of warriors issued swiftly out. Creeping along with noiseless footsteps and with daggers in their hands, they broke into the camp of the unsuspecting foe and slaughtered numbers in their sleep without opposition. The unexpected defection of this pair and the unforeseen massacre of the Persians led to fearful bad blood between us and Sapor, and this was aggravated by the fact that Arsaces' son Pap had left the fortress with a few followers at his mother's insistence and been welcomed by the Emperor Valens. Neocassaria, a well-known town in Pontus, was appointed to be his temporary residence, and generous arrangements were made for his support and upbringing. This act of kindness encouraged Silasses and Artabanes to send envoys to Valens to ask for aid, and to beg that Pap might be given them as their king. For the moment actual aid was refused, but Pap was sent back to Armenia through the agency of the general Terentius, to rule his people without the insignia of royalty for the time being. There was a good reason for this arrangement. It protected us from the charge of violating the treaty and breaking the peace. When he heard what had happened, Sapor's rage knew no bounds. He collected a larger force and set about the devastation of Armenia without disguise. His arrival terrified Pap as well as Silasses and Arrabanes. No help was available, and they took refuge in the high mountains which divided our territory from Lazica. There they remained concealed in the deep forests and ravines for 5 months, eluding every attempt of the king to find them, the latter seeing that he was wasting his time to no purpose under the frosty winter sky, burned all the fruit trees and the forts and the strongholds which he had captured by force or fraud, and surrounded Artaxerxes with all the weight of his forces. Meanwhile, Sapor, that monster of guile, who was conciliatory and overbearing by turns as best suited him, sent a secret message to Pap suggesting a future alliance, and reproaching him for being so careless of his own interests as to be the tool of Silasses and Arrabanes in spite of his appearance of royal power. Pap fell headlong into the trap of these soft words. He killed them both and sent their heads to Sapor as a token of submission. The news of this disaster got abroad, and Armenia would have perished defenceless if the Persians had not been deterred by the arrival of Orintheus. This caused them to defer a second invasion and to content themselves with sending a mission to the emperor asking him to observe the treaty made with Jovian and to withdraw his protection from Armenia. The request was rejected, and Saramyces, who, as I have said, had been driven from the throne of Iberia, was sent back there with Terentius and 12 legions. When he had nearly reached the river Cyrus, Aspicures suggested that, as they were cousins, they should reign jointly. He declared that he could not give way completely or go over to Rome because his son Ultra was still a hostage with the Persians. Learning of this, the emperor acquiesced in the division of Iberia, thinking it a sensible way of allaying the troubles likely to be caused by this affair. The Cyrus was to be the boundary between the two domains, Saramyces keeping the region bordering on Armenia and Lazica, and Aspicures the parts adjoining Albania and Persia. This arrangement enraged Sapor, and he protested that he was being shamefully treated. The Romans had broken the treaty by sending help to the Armenians, and his mission of remonstrance had come to nothing. Moreover, the decision to divide the kingdom of Iberia had been taken without his knowledge or his consent. So he slammed the door on friendship, collected auxiliary troops from the neighbouring peoples, and mobilised his own army, intending at the opening of the warm season to undo all the measures taken by the Romans to protect their interests.